aliens screamed as fire fell from the sky. The ship was crashing, and the planet below was glowing red with Hit Lieutenant. Ray Carter grabbed onto the control rail as sparks flew from every panel he heard, metal groan like a dying animal, and the hull. Our IP open in places. No metal should ever bend alarms. Blared in every direction, and someone was shouting in an alien tongue full of fear. This was how it would end. ... Not with a battle or a noble sacrifice. ... But by being baked alive on a dead world, this planet had no water. ... No wind. ... No shade in the next few minutes. Their survival would come down to one impossible idea: making water. ... From Steam Nat was Ray's plant. That was all they had. The ship smashed into the sand, and silence fell like a curtain. Everything I could break. ... Had broken. Ray blinked slowly as dust filled his helmet, and his ears rang as suit systems were fried. ... His oxygen level was dropping. ... And the temperature gauge was flashing red. Hay pushed a metal beam off his chest and crawled to his knees. The sun was high in the sky, and it looked wrong. ... Too big. ... To close. ... Too angry, he reached for his cum. This is Carter. ... Status report. Anyone static? Crackled then. ... A weak voice, a captain. Virith. ... Barely. ... Primary systems down. ... For injured. Too unresponsive. Ray pulled himself to the top of a dune and looked out. The ship was a wreck. ... Torn in half. ... And black smoke curled into the sky like a funeral flame. The planet's surface was dry and cracked. ... Like it hadn't seen water. In 1,000 years, heat shimmered off the ground in waves. ... And the air tasted like ash. Ray knew one thing. ... If they didn't find water, ... fast, they would all die. He slid back down the dune and found Virith slumped against a twisted support. Beam, the alien captain's blue skin was already peeling under the harsh sun. His eyes were bloodshot. ... And his breathing slow. We have 72 hours at most. ... Virith rasped. Less for the weaker ones. ... Maybe 30. Ray nodded slowly. Then we need a plan that works in 20. I opened a side panel on his suit and pulled out a scanner. It hummed softly. ... Then beeped once. The readout was grim. No visible water sources, no clouds, no underground ice, but something else. Humidity, tiny traces. ... Barely there. ... But real moisture in the air. Looked up at the shimmering sky and narrowed his eyes. There's steam in the atmosphere. It's hot enough to evaporate any surface water instantly. ... But that means it's up there. ... Somewhere we just have to pull it down. Viroth groaned. You humans think everything can be fixed. Sometimes the desert winds. Ray didn't answer. He just walked toward the wreckage and began pulling wires from the broken comms array. He needed parts. ... Something to build a condenser. Something that could pull moisture from hot air and cool it just enough to turn it into liquid, one drop at a time. The others were gathered under what was left of the cargo, but 2 were unconscious. 1 was crying. Quietly. ... The sound almost lost in the wind. They looked at Ray with hollow eyes. They had already accepted death, but Ray had not yet. He spread the parts out on a piece of torn hull and began working. His hands moved quickly. ... Cutting wires. ... Welding panels. Shaping metal. Every so often, he wiped sweat from his face and kept going. Time passed in a strange way. The sun moved, but it never got cooler. His fingers burned on hot metal. His lips cracked. His throat was dry still. He worked when the first piece was done. ... He connected a small power cell and watched as the fan began to spin slow. ... But spinning, he built a crude intake tube using a broken rifle barrel, then added a cooling coil made from the ship's emergency coolant lines when he turned it on. ... The machine hummed. He waited 1 minute, 2. Nothing. He adjusted the intake, cleaned the fan, turned the coil tighter, and then ... A sound, day soft. ... Perfect drip. Ray leaned. Ina, single drop of water. ... Clear and real. Fell into the collection. Trahis smiled, but before he could celebrate, the coolant line burst and hot gas sprayed into his face. He fell back coughing, ... And the device sparked once, ... Then did the aliens stared, one whispered it was working in now. ... It's gone. Ray sat up. No, ... It's not gonna... We just need to build it better. We'll fix it, we'll make it stronger. We'll get more water virus. Crawled to the tray and touched the single drop with a shaking finger. He looked up at Ray Erkine, ... Is insane. Ray smiled again. No. Just thirsty that night. If it could be called night, ... The heat never left the sky turned dark, but the ground still burned. They took shifts. Ray built Viroth, rested one of the others, died in their sleep. There was no sound, just silence, the silence of things ending, but the next day, ... Ray had a new model. He rigged it to a solar panel and reinforced the coil. It took hours, ... But when it ran, ... It made 3 drops, 3 enough for one alien to survive a little longer. Not enough, but something Ray drank none of. I've gave it to thee. Smallest one, she cried when the drops touched her tongue. Tears mixed with the water. Ray turned away. He didn't want to see hope die again, not yet, but the machine was overheating. He needed more power. ... More cooling. He stared at the wrecked ship. There had to be something inside. Something dangerous, something that could give the condenser the boost it needed. He would have to go in alone. The structure wasn't stable and the radiation warnings were blinking red, but he didn't hesitate. He grabbed a toolkit, strapped on a mask, walked toward the heart of the wreck, toward the ship's main reactor. If he could pull power from it, if he could survive the heat, ... he might just turn steam into salvation, or he might die trying. Either way, ... he wouldn't stop, because even in a place where the sun never sleeps, ... and the air itself tries to kill you, a single drop of water can mean the difference between life and death, and Ray Carter was going to fight for every single drop, even if he had to burn for it. The sun never left the sky. It stayed there like a curse, a burning eye that watched them suffer, and the ground below cracked wider with each hour, as if the planet itself was falling apart under the weight of its own heat, and the air was thick, like smoke without fire. And when Ray opened his eyes, it felt like he had slept inside an oven. He sat up slowly, his body heavy, his suit clinging to him, soaked with sweat but dry at the same time, a strange feeling like being wet and dying of thirst. At once, and beside him, the small alien girl named Shella was breathing shallow, her skin pale, and her eyes half closed, and Vareth was nowhere in sight. Trey checked the condenser. The machine still worked, but just barely. The fan sputtered, the cooling coil buzzed, and the tray held only 2 drops, and one had already evaporated while he slept, and it wasn't enough, not even close. Stood up, legs shaking, but forced himself toward the shade where the others were gathered, what was left of them. Anyway, 3 now, just 3, and their eyes followed him like ghosts, hoping he'd say something, anything, but he had no good news to give. Vareth returned crawling across the sand, dragging a broken power cell behind him, his face blistered, his breathing rough. And when he reached Ray, he held out the cell like it was treasure and whispered, "It still has charge." Maybe enough. Ray nodded and took it, his fingers numb and his mind racing, because maybe this was it. Maybe this would give the condenser the boost it needed to make more water faster, to keep them alive a little longer, just enough to get rescued or to build something better, or to hope. He worked in silence, the others watching every move like their lives depended on it, because they did. And he rewired the intake, adjusted the coil, rerouted the fan, and connected the new cell. And when he flipped the switch, the machine came to life. Stronger, louder, hotter. The tray began to fill, not fast, but steady. And after 1 hour, there were 6 drops, 6 real clean, beautiful drops. And for a moment it felt like victory, like something had finally gone right. But then Stella collapsed without a sound. Her body too small, too weak, too far gone. Ray rushed to her side, lifted her gently, and brought the water tray to her lips, and she drank 2 drops, then 3, and her eyes fluttered open barely, and she looked at him with something like wonder, like disbelief, like he was something more than human, and he looked away again because he didn't want to be a hero. He just wanted them to live. Roth watched from the shade, his body shaking, his voice dry and cracked, and he said, "Your machines should not work in this heat." And Ray answered, "I know, but I don't care as long as they do." And Viroth nodded slowly and said, "Then make them work faster, because the others won't last." I knew he was right. The machine was too slow. It gave hope, but not enough, and he needed more power, better cooling, a bigger tray, and maybe a miracle. And he thought of the reactor, the heart of the ship, the dangerous place, filled with radiation and broken systems and heat. It's enough to kill a man in minutes, but also enough power to run the condenser full speed all day. He made his choice. He didn't say goodbye. He just took the toolkit, strapped the mask tighter, and walked toward the wreckage again. The wind kicking sand at his feet and the sun pressing down like a hand on his back in every step felt heavier than the last inside the ship. It was dark and quiet, the silence of machines that once lived and now only whispered. And he moved carefully past sparking wires and hanging metal, careful not to touch anything that might burn or cut or kill, and the heat inside was worse than outside, thicker. Heavier, almost alive, he reached the reactor room, and the door was half open. Bent out of shape, but he squeezed through and stared at the massive core glowing faintly, still alive, still pulsing, and he took a deep breath, or tried to, through the mask, and stepped forward. The panel was fried, but not completely. He could still access the O-port, maybe, just maybe. Pull a line straight from the core to the condenser back outside, and it would either work or explode. But at this point, that was a risk worth taking. He connected the cable, wrapped it tight, shielded it with broken hull plates, and backed away slow and careful. And when he exited the wreck, the others were there waiting, and their eyes widened at the sight of the cable trailing behind him like a lifeline from death. He plugged it in to the condenser, flipped the switch, and stepped back. Machine roared louder than before. The fan spun fast. The coil glowed cold, and water began to drip steadily, more than before, faster, cleaner. And Ray laughed, a dry, broken sound, because it was working. It was finally working. Viroth stood up with effort, walked to him, and said, "You are mad." And Ray replied, "Probably, but you're still alive." And they both smiled a little, because madness and survival were starting to look the same. They filled 3 trays before the cell ran hot, and Ray shut it down to let it cool, and they drank 1 tray between them, passed the second to the others, and saved the third for later, and for the first time since. Crashing, there was silence without fear, but it didn't last. One of the aliens, the one named Drazes, began to cough blood, a thin stream that stained the sand, and Ray rushed to him, checked his vitals, but it was too late. The heat and dehydration had done too much damage, and Drazes died with his hand on the tray, as if trying to hold on to one last drop. Ray closed his eyes and took a breath, and Viroth said, "We are losing too fast." And Ray answered, "Then we need to move faster." And they looked at the machine, and both knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. Not like this. Ray had one more idea. One more crazy, impossible idea, and it would require going back into the reactor deeper, this time closer to the main coolant chamber. Maybe he could salvage the pipes, use them to build a secondary coil, boost the water production, double or triple it, but it meant risking everything again. It didn't hesitate. He just grabbed his tools and walked back into the heat, because the others were counting on him. And he wouldn't let them die, not while he still had breath, not while there was still steam in the air and metal in his hands and fire in his heart. And somewhere deep inside, he believed one truth louder than the sun and stronger than death: where there is heat, there is vapor, and where there is vapor, there is hope. The air was thick like soup, and every breath Ray took felt like fire crawling down his throat. But he kept going. His boots crunching against burnt metal and cracked sand as he stepped into the wreckage again, the world outside still blazing under the sun that never set, and the bodies of the fallen crew buried in shallow, heat-scorched graves behind him. But he had no time to mourn, no space in his heart for sorrow, not while the others still needed him, not while Sella clung to life, and Viroth kept watch with eyes that had seen too much and trusted too little inside the broken ship. It was worse than before. The heat doubled, the air heavy like steam pressing on his chest, the reactor chamber ahead glowing in the dark, pulsing slowly like a beast in pain. And every step toward it felt like walking deeper into a furnace. But Ray knew what he needed. He needed the coolant pipes, thick coils of metal lined with special materials designed to hold back heat, to keep the core stable and If he could rip them out and turn them into a second condenser coil, maybe? Just maybe he could triple the water output and buy them more time, more drops, more chances at survival. He reached the pipes, and his gloves burned just touching the outer casing, but he worked fast cutting clamps, unbolting seals, ignoring the warning lights that flickered angry red in his visor. He pulled with everything he had, sweat blinding his eyes, and metal screaming as it gave way. And when the pipe finally came, Lucy fell backward, nearly losing his grip, and cracked his arm against the floor, but he didn't let go. He dragged the heavy coil behind him out of the wreckage, out into the blinding sun, and dropped it beside the first machine. His chest heaving, Virith appeared from the shade, his steps slow but steady, his voice dry as sand as he asked, "What is that?" And Ray answered, "It's our second chance, and maybe our last." And without waiting, he began shaping the pipe, flattening sections, folding them tight, coiling them into shape, and then connecting it to the main system using spare cables and heat sinks. He had scavenged from the old thruster panels, and when it was ready, he linked it to the power line, ran the coolant fluid through it, and held his breath as he flipped the switch. The machine hissed, the fan roared, the new coil vibrated, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the sound changed, a lower hum like something waking up, in water began to drip, not one drop at a time, but 3, 4, 5 in quick rhythm, faster than before. Clear, cool, real, and Ray almost laughed out loud because it was working. It was really working. Sella crawled to the edge of the tray, her lips cracked, her hands shaking, and Ray helped her drink, and this time her eyes stayed open, brighter, stronger, and she smiled, a small, weak smile that hit Ray harder than any punch because it meant hope was growing. Again, drop by drop, breath by breath, Viroth took a sip, then backed away, letting the others have more, and when Ray looked at him, the captain said, "You are not like other humans." And Ray shrugged and said, "Maybe, but we're all just trying to stay alive." And Virith nodded slowly and said, "No, you are doing more than that. You are giving life when even the stars gave none." Ray didn't know how to answer that, so he turned back to the machine, checked the coils, adjusted the flow, made sure everything held, and let the system run through the burning day, gathering water in 3 trays, now rotating them every hour and rationing, carefully giving more to the weakest and none to himself. Time passed like a strange dream, the sky never changing, the heat never fading, but the water kept coming, and for a moment it felt like they might actually survive. That maybe rescue would come, or maybe they could signal someone, or build a beacon with what little power they had left. Then the wind changed. Started as a whisper, then grew louder, faster, hotter, and the sky darkened, not from night but from the storm rising over the horizon, a wall of dust and heat and static roaring toward them like an angry god. And Ray stared at it with dread in his chest because he knew what it meant. The machine couldn't survive that, not in the open, not unprotected, and they couldn't move it, not without breaking it, and without it they were deady. Turned to Virith, who was already gathering the trays and shielding Sella with his body, and Ray shouted, "We have to build a shelter around it, something strong enough to block the sand and heat and fast enough to finish before it hits." And Virith said, "We have minutes, not hours." And Ray said, "Then let's not waste them." They ran to the wreck, pulled panels, ripped sheets of hull, dragged them across the sand, burned. Their hands cut, their arms bent, their backs, and built a dome around the machine using anything they could find, sealing the cracks with melted wire and sand, pressing metal into metal, bolting it down with makeshift spikes, and covering the top with fire blanket from the emergency kits. The wind howled closer, and the sky turned red, and Ray threw the last panel in place just as the storm hit a wall of fury, slamming into them, tearing at their suits, blasting sand into every crack in the sound like 1,000 screams all at once, and they huddled together inside the half-covered shelter, clinging to each other as the storm tore at their world and time. Lost all meaning, Ray held the power cable in one hand and the coolant pipe in the other, praying they didn't snap, and listened to the water tray inside the dome still filling, drip, 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 the sound barely reaching him through the chaos, but enough to know it was still working, still alive. The storm lasted for hours, or maybe just minutes, but when it finally passed, the air was still, the ground covered in a layer of fine red dust, and the sun returned like nothing had happened. But the dome still stood, and the condenser inside still hummed, and the trays were full. They had done it. They had saved the machine, saved the water, saved themselves for. Now, Worth collapsed beside the dome, his body shaking, and Ray checked his vitals, low but stable, and Sella lay curled under the blanket, her breathing calm, her eyes closed in. Sleep, and for the first time since crashing, Ray allowed himself to sit, to breathe, to close his eyes. Just for a moment, and in that moment, he knew they had made it through the worst, but not the end. Not yet. The machine was working better than ever. But their bodies were weak, their supplies almost gone, and no rescue had come. No signal had been answered, and the sky above still stretched wide and empty and cruel. But Ray looked at the water trays, the steady drip, the growing pools, and he knew one thing for certain: as long as that machine ran, as long as steam filled the air, as long as he could stand and build and fix and fight, they had a chance, and that was enough. The water trays were full again, the sun still burning above, but now it felt weaker. Not because the heat had faded, but because hope had grown stronger, and Ray stood by the machine watching the drops fall steady, clean, beautiful, each one a small miracle. And beside him, Sella smiled quietly, her eyes brighter, her hands no longer shaking, and Virith sat nearby, sharpening a broken piece of metal as if preparing for something unseen. They had survived the storm, they had survived the heat, they had survived themselves, but now a different problem stood in front of them. One Ray had tried not to think about until now, because it was harder than heat, harder than fire, harder than fear. There wasn't enough water for all of them, not fast enough, not in the time they needed it to be, and the machine was working at full capacity, running off the reactor in extra coils, but it could only produce so much, and there were still 3 of them alive, and all 3 needed more than the machine could. Given one day, Ray did the math again in his head over and over, and every time it came back the same: too little, too slow, too late. And he felt the weight of it pressing on his chest, tighter than the storm, tighter than the desert. Vorth noticed and said, "You have been quiet," and Ray answered, "We have a choice to make." And Virith looked at him, eyes steady, unreadable, and said, "I know. I have known for some time." And Ray asked how, and Virith said, "Because I am a captain, and a captain always knows when the cost must be paid." Ray shook his head, not ready, not yet, and said, "Maybe we can find more parts, maybe. We can build a second machine. Maybe the signal will go through and someone will come." And Virith said, "Maybe, but the sky has not spoken, and we cannot live on maybes." That night, Ray stayed awake, sitting by the machine, watching the drip, 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 and listening to the desert breathe, and the stars above looked cold and far away, like they didn't care what happened down here. And he thought about Earth and green grass and rain and oceans and everything he had taken for granted and now missed more than anything. He thought about Sella and her small hands and bright eyes, and the way she still smiled, even after everything, in Virith, and his quiet strength and broken pride, and the crew they had lost, and the way silence followed each death, like a shadow. And then he thought about himself and the choices he had to make, and he hated every one of them. By morning, he had made his decision. He didn't like it, but he knew it was the only one that gave anyone a real chance. He called them both over and explained the numbers, the rate of water, the time left, the limits they were up against. And when he was done, Sella looked scared, and Virith looked calm. Ray said, "If we split the water evenly, none of us will make it." Virith nodded slowly and asked, "How do you want to decide?" Shrey said, "I'll take myself out of the count. I'll keep the machine running. I'll use the minimum I can, just enough to stay on my feet. You to take the rest?" Sella cried quietly and said, "No, that's not fair." And Ray said, "Life's not fair, but it's what we have, and we don't have time to argue." And Virith placed a hand on his shoulder, strong and firm, and said, "No, human, you have done more than we ever could without you. We are already dead, and I cannot allow you to become a ghost just to save you." Shrey looked him in the eye and said, "Then what do we don't?" Virith said, "We do what we were trained to do. We survive. By any means, and if that means choosing who lives and who falls, then I choose to fall because I am old, because I have already led, because Sella is young, and her life can carry meaning beyond this place." And Ray started to protest, but Virith raised his hand and said, "I am your superior in rank, and I am giving you a direct order. Protect her, keep her alive, finish what you started then. He walked away into the sun, toward the wreckage the place where silence waited and Ray stood frozen. And Sella screamed and ran after him, grabbing his arm, begging him not to go. But Virith only smiled and said, "You are the future, little one now. Go make it happen." Then he was gone. Ray carried Sella back to the shelter, held her as she cried, and the machine kept humming, and the water kept dripping. And now there were only two of them left, and Ray hated everything. But he kept going because that's what Virith had told him to do, and because Sella was still breathing over the next 2 days. Ray kept the machine running, cleaned the coils, adjusted the intake, checked the power line, reinforced the dome, and rationed the water with painful care. And Sella got stronger little by little, and Ray got weaker. But he hid it behind tired smiles and bad jokes, and every time she looked at him, he felt the weight of Virith's choice settle deeper in his bones. The third day the comes unit beep tay. Weak signal barely there, cutting through static, and Ray jumped to his feet and ran to the panel and shouted into the mic, "This is Lieutenant Ray Carter, stranded on planet Zeta 9. Crash survivors requesting immediate evac code red priority." And the signal hissed. Then a voice answered, barely audible, "This is Rescue Vessel Arcus. We read you. Hold position. Atmospheric interference is high, but we are tracking your beacon. ETA. 12 hours standby, and stay strong, Ray." Collapsed against the panel, laughing and crying at the same time, and Sella ran to him, and he lifted her up and spun her slowly, and she laughed, and for the first time since the crash, the sound felt clean and real and alive. They had made it almost just a little longer. 12 hours. Ray checked the machine, made sure it would last, powered up the beacon again, prepared the flare just in case, and sat back against the dome, his body aching, his head light, his throat dry. And Sella leaned against him, her eyes already closing, and he whispered, "Just a little more. Just one more day, and then we're going home." And far above them the stars blinked like they were smiling for once, and the desert wind whispered, not with death, but with peace, and the machine kept dripping, and the sun kept burning, and hope did not die. The hours passed slowly, like thick honey sliding down the side of a glass, and Ray watched the horizon with tired eyes, every minute feeling longer than the last, his body weak but his mind alert, because he could not rest, not now, not when they were so close to being saved, not when help was finally on its way. And Sella slept curled up in the shade, her breathing calm, her skin no longer dry, and her eyes peaceful. And Ray felt something deep in his chest, something like pride, something like relief. Condenser kept working, humming softly, dripping water into the trays, steady and faithful, and Ray checked the connections, made sure the coil was not overheating, and wiped the dust from the fan, and the solar cable was holding the reactor line was stable, and everything was running better than he had hoped. And yet the air around him felt heavier than before, and the sky was too quiet, and that silence made him nervous. He looked up, saw the sun still burning high, saw no clouds, no storm, no wind, and yet something felt wrong, something he could not name. And then he heard a sound, a low hum, not from the machine but from the sky, and he stood, quickly grabbing the flare gun and squinting into the light, and for a moment he saw it, a shadow passing through the upper atmosphere, a ship dark and silent and far away, and it was not the Arcastray. Frowned his heart, speeding up his hands, tightening around the flare, because that ship was not moving like a rescue vessel, and its shape was not human. And then as crackled a burst of static, and a voice that was not friendly came through, speaking in a language he did not understand, and then switching to broken English. Unauthorized presence detected, vessel of unknown origin, prepare for inspection. Ray cursed under his breath and ran to the beacon, switching channels, trying to contact the Arcus, but the signal was dead, blocked, jammed, silenced, and he knew then that this new ship was not here to help, and not here to rescue, and not here for peace. He ran back to the shelter, woke Sella, gently whispered, "Stay low, stay quiet, and keep your eyes open." And she nodded, eyes wide, full of fear, but trusting him completely, and he handed her a small knife, not much but better than nothing. And she gripped it tightly without a word. The ship descended slowly, the hum growing louder, the heat around them shifting, and Ray grabbed the flare gun and moved to the edge of the wreckage, hiding behind a broken wing and watching as the craft touched down, kicking up dust and steam, and a ramp unfolded, and 3 figures stepped out, tall, thin-armored with helmets that reflected the sun and weapons that buzzed softly in the silence. They scanned the area, moving slowly, methodically, and Ray stayed perfectly still, breathing slow, watching their movements, studying their patterns, and waiting for a chance, waiting for anything. And then one of them pointed at the condenser, walked toward it with long strides, and raised a weapon. Ray moved. Before he could think, ran from cover, aimed the flare gun, and fired. The bright light exploded in the air. A signal, a scream, a warning, and the aliens turned quickly, raising weapons and shouting, and Ray dove behind the machine, shielding it with his body, yelling, "No, stop! It's just water, just water!" And for a moment no one moved. Then one alien lowered his weapon, stepped forward, and looked at Ray through his helmet, and said, "This device violates containment law. All unauthorized harvesting must be destroyed." And Ray shouted, "It's saving lives. You can't take it. You can't kill it." And the alien raised his hand against Sella, screamed, and ran from the shelter, knife in hand, her small figure charging across the sand like a spark. And Ray shouted, "No, stay back," but it was too late. She reached the alien, stabbed his leg, and he shouted in pain, falling to one knee, and the others raised their weapons. And Ray grabbed Sella, pulling her behind the dome as shots fired, scorching the air, hitting the sand, missing them by inches. He covered her with his body, held her tight, and whispered, "It's
okay. I've got you, I've got you."
And she cried into his shoulder, and the machine still hummed behind them, the water still dripping, and Ray knew this was the end, unless something changed, unless someone came. Then a new sound broke through the chaos, a louder hum, a deeper roar, and Ray looked up and saw it, the Arcus, finally descending through the upper sky, weapons, hot engines, bright and fast, and the enemy ship began to rise, began to flee, but the Arcus fired first, a warning shot that shook the ground, and the enemy ship retreated fast, disappearing into the upper atmosphere like a ghost. Ray stood slowly, pulling Sella up with him, both of them shaking, covered in dust and sweat, and the rescue ship landed nearby, doors opening, medics running out, soldiers scanning the area, and one of them ran too. Ray grabbed his arm and said, "Are you Lieutenant Carter?" And Ray nodded, and the soldier smiled and said, "We've been trying to reach you. Your signal was blocked, but we got your flare. You held on long enough." Asai smiled weakly and said, "Not just me, we all did." And he looked at Stella, and then at the condenser, still humming, still alive, and he whispered, "You're coming with us?" And the medic checked his vitals, shook his head, and said, "You need rest now. You're dehydrated and burned and lucky to be standing." And Ray said, "I'll rest on the ship, just not here. Not again." They carried Sella into the Arcus, placed her on a bed, gave her water, real clean cold water from Earth, and she laughed softly and said, "It tastes the same." And Ray laughed too. Even though it hurt, because that small sentence meant everything, he sat beside her, eyes closing. As the engines roared and the ship lifted off, and below them the planet grew smaller, shrinking into a red scar in the middle of nothing, and beside him the medics checked the readings, the soldiers secured the ship, and Shella leaned against his arm and whispered, "We made it." And he whispered back, "Yes, we did." The Arcus flew into the stars, leaving behind the wreck, the graves, the heat, and the storm, but carrying with it the last two survivors of something impossible in a machine that turned steam into hope. Hand for the first time in days, Ray Carter slept, not because he was tired, but because he knew they were safe. They called his name again and again, but Ray did not answer right away, because he was drifting through something soft, something quiet, something unlike anything he had felt since the crash, and his body floated somewhere between pain and peace. And the noise around him was distant, like echoes underwater, and it took time for his eyes to open, and when they did, the light was soft, not the harsh red sun, but cool, white, and steady, like a hospital back on Earth. The room was quiet, filled with low beeps and the gentle hum of a life support monitor. And for a moment Ray thought maybe he had died, and this was some gentle corner of the afterlife. But then he saw the water pouch hanging beside his bed and the scar on his arm from the reactor coil, and he remembered everything, and it hurt, but it also brought relief, because pain meant he was still alive. He turned his head slowly and saw Sella asleep on the other bed, her breathing calm, her face no longer pale, no longer dry, and someone had braided her hair and wrapped her in a clean blanket, and her fingers still clutched the edge like she was afraid it would disappear, and Ray smiled slightly because that fear was one he understood. The door slid open, and a human officer stepped. Dressed in rescue fleet uniform, holding a tablet, and looking both relieved and curious. And when he saw Ray awake, he walked over and said softly, "You're tougher than you look." Lieutenant Carter, and Ray's voice came out rough like sandpaper. As he answered, "Didn't know I had any toughness left," and the officer smiled and said, "Well, you do, and it saved more than just yourself out there." He tapped the tablet and brought up the image of the condenser now sealed inside a lab chamber on board. The Arcus being studied by science officers and engineers and environmental survival experts, and the image zoomed in, showing the coils still coated in dust, still bent from heat, still dripping with water, and the officer said, "You took scrap and fire and made a miracle." And Ray said, "I just didn't want to die thirsty." And the officer laughed and said, "That's how all the best inventions begin." They talked more about what happened, about the hostile ship that had intercepted the signal, about the emergency protocol that finally broke through the interference, about how the Arcus had traced the final flare and rushed through the atmosphere before the attackers could finish what they started, and Ray listened quietly, absorbing each word, like it was part of a dream that had taken too long to end. Later, Viroth's name was spoken, and Ray closed his eyes for a long time and said, "He gave us time," and the officer nodded and said, "We will make sure his story is told with honor," and Ray whispered, "That's all I ask." And they left him alone with those thoughts. Sen. The following days, the Arcus made its way back to Federation space, and Ray began to recover slowly, his strength returning bit by bit, and Sella never left his side, always quiet, always watchful, and the two of them spoke less with words and more with silence and shared glances, because some things do not need to be said when you've lived through fire together. One afternoon, a young science officer came to his room, her face eager, her hands full of diagrams, and she explained how they were replicating the condenser, how it could be mass-produced, how desert colonies could now survive with just heat and scrap and hope. And Ray listened and smiled and nodded, because hearing that was worth every burn, every drop of sweat, every broken night under a deadly sky before arrival at the central station. They held a small ceremony on board the observation deck, stars around them like endless watchers, and the crew gathered to honor the lives lost and the lives saved, and Ray was given a medal, though he didn't want one, and a title. He never asked for it, and they called him Rainmaker, a name whispered in many languages. With quiet respect, Sella stood beside him, holding a small metal pendant shaped like a water droplet, and said she would keep it forever. And Ray said, "Just don't forget what it cost." And she looked at the stars and said, "I won't, because I remember everything." When the Arcus docked at the orbital platform above Earth, the first thing Ray did was ask for a glass of real water, not filtered, not stored, it's not condensed, but straight from a spring. And when he drank it, he closed his eyes and tasted it like it was gold, and said, "This is what life feels like." Later, he stood in front of a council, not to be judged, but to be thanked, and they asked him what he had learned out there, and he said that thirst is more than needing water. It is the feeling of fading when no one sees you. It is the fire of holding on when your hands are empty and your world is dying, and that's sometimes all it takes to fight. Back is one drop, and the will to protect it. They recorded everything, turned it into reports and data and case studies and broadcasts. But Ray didn't care about any of that, because what mattered was Sella smiling in a real bed. What mattered was the machines being built on frontier worlds. What mattered was that Viroth's name was spoken with honor. What mattered was that someone somewhere would live, because he refused to let them end every time he passed a sink stream. A bottle, he remembered the steam rising over a broken planet and the sound of a single drop falling into a metal tray, and he never took water for granted. Again, the air was cool on his skin as Ray stood beneath the Earth's sky for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, and the breeze carried scents. He had forgotten trees and ocean and clean air, not filtered, not recycled, but real and alive, and he looked up at the endless blue And for a moment, he didn't speak. He just breathed because breathing itself now felt like a gift. He walked through the memorial garden where a small plaque had been placed, not with his name, but with Viroth's the brave warrior who had stood between death and survival, with nothing but strength and loyalty, and the plaque shimmered with a quiet dignity carved in both human and Zentari script, and the words read, "He gave everything so others could live," and Ray reached out and touched the metal gently, whispering, "Thank you, old friend," and he knew that Vareth was more than a name, he was a legacy. Sella ran ahead chasing butterflies through the garden, laughing a sound that once would have been impossible in a world of heat and silence and death, and now echoed through green leaves and sunlight, and Ray smiled as he watched her because she was alive. And she was free, and she had a future, and that was all he had ever wanted for her. The Federation had built a prototype condenser in the desert colony of Theron, for where the soil cracked under the sun, and now for the first time in years, crops were growing and children were playing near pools of clean water, and a statue stood in the center, shaped like a drop of water held between two hands, one human, one alien, and its name was Hope Engine, and Ray didn't care that they named it after the machine he had built because he knew it wasn't about the parts or the design, it was about the idea. The choice to fight when giving up would have been easier. He declined offers to speak on networks, to write books, to attend ceremonies. He wasn't a hero, he said. He was just a man who got tired of being thirsty and decided to do something about it. And that was enough. He and Sella settled in a quiet place near the ocean where the waves never stopped, and every morning they would sit on the rocks with their feet in the water and drink fresh tea and speak about simple things, and sometimes about stars and machines and ghosts of fire, but never about fear, because fear had no place here anymore. Night she would ask him to tell the story again about the planet with no water and the machine made from steam and scraps, and Ray would say only, "If you promise to sleep afterward," and she would laugh and say, "I always do," and he would begin once upon a time in the middle of nowhere, where even the wind forgot how to blow. There was a man and a girl and a dream, and they turned heat into hope and silence into song, and she would close her eyes and dream of stars. Andre would look out at the ocean and know that somewhere out there another storm would rise, another ship would fall, another life would hang on a thread, and maybe, just maybe, someone else would remember this story and fight not with weapons but with courage and a tool built by hands that refused to give up, because life always finds a way when someone dares to try, and in the end there was no need for medals or monuments, or memory, just a drop of water and the will to protect at the end.